greenhouse gas emissions fueling climate change has passed. Only 15 countries met it, less than 8% of the 194 parties currently signed up to the Paris Agreement, which obliges countries to submit new proposals for eliminating emissions every 5 years, known as Nationally Determined Contribution or NDC. These plans outline how each country intends to help limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels or at most 2 degrees centigrade. This might include cutting emissions by generating more energy from wind and solar, or adapting to a heating world by restoring wetlands as protection against more severe floods and wildfires. Each new NDC should outline more stringent emission cuts than the last. It should also show how each country seeks to mitigate climate change over the following 10 years. This system is designed to progressively strengthen global efforts to combat climate change. The February 2025 deadline for submitting NDC was set 9 months before the next UN climate change conference, COP30 in Belém, Brazil. Without a comprehensive set of NDC for countries to compare themselves against, there will be less pressure on negotiators to raise national ambitions. Assessing how much money certain countries need to decarbonize and adapt to climate change and how much is available will also be more difficult. While countries can continue to submit NDC, the poor compliance rate so far suggests a lack of urgency that bodes ill for avoiding the worst climate outcomes this century. Who submitted? The 15 countries that submitted NDC on time include the United Arab United Arab Emirates, the UK, Switzerland, Ecuador, and a number of small states such as Andorra and the Marshall Islands. COP30 have host Brazil submitted a pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 59 to 67% by 2035 compared to 2005 level. This is up from its previous commitment, a 37% reduction by 2025 and 43% by 2030. Unfortunately, Brazil is not on track to meet its 2025 target and has set a more recent emissions baseline that will make any reduction more modest than they had otherwise be. Japan aims to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 60% in 2035 and 73% in 2040 compared to 2013 levels. Japan's previous target was for a 46% reduction by 2030. This demonstrates how the ratchet system is supposed to work. The UK's NDC, which pledged to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions by at least 81% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels, was described by independent scientists as compatible with limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The US submitted to a plan to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 61 to 66% below 2005 levels by 2035. However, this was before Donald Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. So the commitment of one of the world's largest polluters is in doubt. Who did not submit? Some of the world's largest emitters failed to submit new NDC, including China, India, and Russia. India pledged to reduce its emission by 35% below 2005 levels by 2030 at the signing of the Paris Agreement. All of the country's subsequent NDC have been rated as insufficient by independent scientists. India's recent national budget announcement offered scant additional funding for climate mitigation and adaptation measures. China also made big promises in 2015 with its aim to lower its carbon dioxide emission by 65% by 2030 from a 2000 baseline. However, China has been responsible for over 90% of global carbon dioxide emissions growth. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, China and the US also suspended formal discussion on climate change in 2022. Increased economic competition between these two nations has resulted in export control restrictions and tariffs, which have made technology like green technologies like electric vehicles more expensive, which is certain to slow down the shift from fossil fuels. Russia joined the Paris Agreement in 2019. Its first NDC was labeled critically insufficient by scientists, and its follow up in 2020 did not include increased targets. Russia is maximizing the extraction of resources such as oil, gas, and minerals, and its 2035 strategy for the Arctic included plans to sink several oil wells on the continental shelf. With the USA's 2025 NDC in limbo, President Trump is eyeing mineral reserves in Ukraine and Greenland, further ramping up oil production and cutting international climate research funding. The European Union could have positioned itself as a leader of global climate action in lieu of US involvement. But the EU, which submits NDC as a bloc alongside individual countries' mission, also failed to submit on time. Global shifts. The failure of most nations to submit new emissions plan suggests that the era of cooperation on climate change is over. The largest and most powerful of these nations are growing their military and diplomatic presence around the world, particularly in countries with large reserves of critical minerals for electric vehicles and other technology relevant to decarbonization. And the lack of NDC from these nations may be less a matter of middling green emissions, more an attempt to disguise their planned exploitation of other countries' resources. If countries keep failing to submit enhanced NDC or even withdraw from their commitments entirely, scientists warn that global heating could reach a catastrophic catastrophic 4.4 degrees centigrade by 2100. This scenario assumes the continued unabated use of fossil fuels with little regard for the climate. In a more optimistic scenario, countries could limit warming to around 1.8 degrees centigrade by 2100. This will require global cooperation and significant investment in green technology and entail a transition to net zero emissions by mid century. This is a process that must include everyone. Simply having the most powerful nations decarbonize by exploiting and hoarding resources will imperil this critical target. The actual outcome will probably fall somewhere between these two scenarios depending on forthcoming NDC and how quickly and thoroughly they are implemented. All of the scenarios envisaged by climate scientists will involve warming continuing for decades. The effects of this warming will vary, however, based on the path we choose today. Thank you. Please subscribe, like, and comment.